hand over to Dr. Chris Watkin. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Kevin. Now I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. And while I do that, just let me say what a thrill and an honor it is for me to be giving this particular seminar. I learned so much from Christian Heritage during my time in Cambridge, and I feel very humbled to be asked to speak to you guys now. And I'm quite excited as well about the things that we're going to think about together today, which I think, and I hope will become clear, are really quite pressing issues, both for the church and the world today. The title is Obedient Subversiveness, 9 ways in which the Bible fosters rich cultural criticism. So let's get going. I fear that this cartoon sums up many people's attitude to Christian cultural critique. It's narrow. It looks for simple moral messages. It looks for isolated motifs in cultural artifacts like witchcraft, for example, and it dismisses whole genres, whole books, whole films because of these blinkered criteria. I think it's fair to say that not many people would turn to their Christian friends or to Christian publications today for an insightful take on the latest cultural trend. And in many ways, that's not surprising. Christians are not known for being great cultural critics today. Our reputation for cultural mediocrity is so often very richly deserved as well. There's a lot to be said about the failings of Christians in this area. I think it's an important story to tell, but it's not the story that I want to tell in this seminar. This seminar is about how elements of the Christian view of the world that can be found in the Bible ought to predispose Christians to be better cultural critics than we otherwise would be. In other words, how the Bible is always nudging us, dragging us towards better cultural critique, not worse cultural critique. So let's get some ideas straight before we dive into these 9 points today. Let's think first of all about critique. There are 2 broad senses of critique. In the everyday way that we use the word, it means being negative about something, doesn't it? If I critique you, I'm going to point out your flaws and your shortcomings. But there's also, of course, a broader sense. We use theatre critic, for example, as a term, not to mean someone who says negative things about theatre, but someone who gives insightful judgments that can be either positive or negative about particular theatrical productions. And it's this broader sense of critique that I mean in this session. As for culture, I'm using what you might call a mezzanine definition of culture. So at its most narrow, culture is Shakespeare and Picasso. At its broadest, culture is absolutely everything that human beings do. I'm meaning something in the middle. So I'm meaning films and novels and TV shows and fashion and adverts and consumer products and architecture and so forth. That's what I mean by culture in this session. And in the title, I have this idea of rich cultural criticism. I struggled a lot with this word. It's the best of a bad job, to be quite frank. Better cultural criticism sort of begs the question, doesn't it? What do we mean by better? That really doesn't help us at all. And if we said something like godly or biblical cultural criticism, well, that sounds tautologous, because obviously the Bible is going to give you that, isn't it? So by rich, I mean a mode of cultural critique that's able to engage with and respond sensitively to a broad range of cultural phenomena, both in their own terms to understand what they're trying to do as they see it, but also in relation to its own sensitivities and concerns. That's this idea of rich. Now, the first question that I want to address today might sound odd, and the response might sound even odder. But here we go. Can there be cultural criticism without God? And my answer is going to be no, they can't. So I think I need to explain myself. There are 3 layers of God's influence on cultural criticism, and I think we can represent them in terms of 3 concentric circles. So in the outer circle, we've got God's common grace, by which we mean every favor, every blessing that God bestows on the whole world, so short of salvation. We've got material blessings, intellectual insight, the mitigation of sin, and we've got James in his letter, what James in his letter calls every good and perfect gift. Now, all cultural criticism benefits from this common grace, wherever that criticism comes from in the world and at whatever point in history. And the important principle that flows from this is that there is therefore no cultural criticism that is utterly without God, standing on its own feet without borrowing from God's goodness or from God's cultural capital, if you like, at all. There is no strictly secular cultural criticism on a Christian view because of God's common grace. The middle circle is the circle of biblical influence, or what we might call the circle of Christendom. Those cultures where God's special revelation in the Bible has helped to, over the centuries, shape people's sensibilities and engagement with the world. And this, of course, would include all of Europe and criticism coming out of the US as well. Because in these cultures, Christian ideas and Christian sensibilities and sensitivities, Christian values are so deeply part of the social imaginary of these cultures that it's simply impossible to think and to evaluate culture in a way that has nothing to do with biblical revelation. So in this second circle, you'd have figures like Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, all of whom in different ways are drawing on Christian ideas. Richard Dawkins also finds himself in this circle, oozing biblical sensibilities at the very moment that he lambasts the Bible. And then right in the center, we've got that cultural criticism which seeks explicitly to draw on biblical resources for its engagement with culture. And it's this inner circle that I'm going to be focusing on mainly in this seminar now. So then, 9 reasons why the Bible should dispose Christians to rich cultural critique. Let's go. Number 1, the creator-creature distinction. Nothing in creation is absolutely good or absolutely evil. So, according to the Bible, God is separate from the world that he's created. Theologians call this the creator-creature distinction. And this term captures the idea that there are 2, and only 2, fundamental different types of existence. There's God's existence and the existence of the universe that he's created. And God is not the same sort of thing as the universe that he's made. He's eternal, for example, and it isn't. And because we learn in Mark 10:18 that, as Jesus says, no one is good but God alone, then for Christians, our measure of what is good is not found within the universe. Nothing within the universe fundamentally that tells us what is ultimately good. It's God who tells us what is ultimately good, and he is not part of the universe. And therefore, it follows that nothing and no one within creation is completely and purely good, because only God is good. No cultural artifact, no novel, no play, no building is utterly good. Everything is a mixture. And what does this mean then for cultural criticism? Well, it means that a biblical attitude to this world can neither be one of simple affirmation nor one of straightforward condemnation in any particular instance. Wherever Christians look in the cultural and intellectual world, we're going to find rebellion against God. No movement, no artifact, no ideology, no text, no performance, no church, no academic discipline is going to be free from the violence and the selfishness and the rebellion of sin, however Christian they might appear. And similarly, nothing in all of culture is so full of these things that it can fully erase the original goodness of creation. So that's the Christian view. But by contrast, if the world is all there is, if there's no God, and if you want to have a functioning ethics, then you've either got to find the ultimate measure of good in this world, which is the left-hand diagram on the screen at the moment. Perhaps you're going to find that ultimate measure of good in the proletariat, or in the free market, or in reason as opposed to superstition, in something within the world. Or the other option, the right-hand diagram, you don't have a measure of good at all. But finding your ultimate measure of good in this world, the left-hand diagram, leads to a closed and a prejudicial attitude to culture, because whatever gives you your ultimate measure of good in this world is going to have to remain unquestionable for you. And if you refuse to find any measure of good in this world, the right-hand diagram, it leads to an anything goes cultural relativism. And both of these points, both of these options, are poor starting points for cultural critique. But the Bible, by contrast, combines the best of both worlds. It has a measure of good and evil, but that measure is not located in this world. And therefore, biblical cultural critique is open to the mixed nature of everything in this world. And this means that the Christian approach should be unusually open, unusually willing to engage with all cultural expressions, unusually discerning, finding elements to commend and elements to reject in every cultural artifact and every cultural phenomenon. Number two, the internal fault line. No individual or group or part of creation is absolutely good or evil. It flows from the first principle that no individual, no group in society, no aspect of creation is utterly and unredeemably evil, and no group is utterly pure. But let's call this the internal fault line for reasons that I hope will become clear in a moment. We've got a propensity as modern Western people to draw fault lines within the world, and to call one part of the world good and another part of the world evil. It's a recurring symptom. It's even a recurring pathology of our tradition. Sometimes these lines are drawn between different aspects of creation. So the Christian philosopher Herman Doiviet, for example, identifies three such dichotomous ways of understanding the world in the history of Western thought. He calls them three different ground motives. So the Greeks, according to Doiviet, divided the world between form and matter, exalting the former and denigrating the latter. The medievals made the division between nature and grace. And the modern world, according to Doiviet, makes the division between nature and freedom. And in each case, part of the world is seen as the problem, and another part of the world is seen as the solution, which is going to make you closed-minded, isn't it? In denigrating the former and in pursuing the latter. And this fault line between good and evil has also frequently been drawn between not different parts of the world this time, but different human faculties. So Plato, for example, considers the reason superior to the senses, as does Descartes. Whereas, flip it over, the 19th century romantics, like Blake and Byron, contrast sentiment and imagination, which they favor, to be superior over reason, which very often they denigrate. A third way in which we draw lines between good and evil is between different social groups. So take the French Revolution as an example. The French revolutionaries opposed the monarchy and all thinking that supported it, and enforced conformity to that ideology by the guillotine. So important was it to eradicate all monarchical thinking from society that it was worth killing those people who held on to that particular way of thinking. And this is also a pathology of the cruder forms of identity politics today, designating some swathes of the population as only and always victims, and other broad social groups as only and always oppressors. And all of these dichotomies, all of these ways of chopping up the world, make you closed-minded, because they all create an antagonism in which something must be overcome and destroyed or transcended in order for something else to be liberated. So matter must be transcended, for example, in order to ascend to the pure world of the forms, as in Plato's cave allegory. Or sentiment and whimsy must be subdued in order for reason to hold sway. Or the king must be beheaded in order for the republic to be born. But Christianity frames things differently. There is a fault line for Christianity, but it doesn't run between aspects of creation. It doesn't run between human faculties, and it doesn't run between social groups in the same way. It runs down the middle of all of them. And it's not a binary opposition, but a narrative division, if you like, into three moments of creation and fall and redemption. Everything is caught up in a complex story in which it's created good, it's marred by the fall, and it is redeemable through Christ. So it's not that the material world is inherently corrupt and the immaterial is inherently pure, but that both the ideal and the material are created things subject to the fall that can be redeemed. It's not that the imagination is inherently corrupt and reason is inherently pure, but both imagination and reason are created good. They're fallen and they're redeemable. And biblically speaking, the line between good and evil doesn't run between us and them. Whether the us part is the good or the evil, it doesn't matter. Neither of those is true, but both groups, both us and them, are implotted according to this threefold structure. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't lead to some sort of ethical porridge in which all groups are just as good and just as bad as each other. No, far from that. But it does prevent this sort of black hat and white hat wearing simplicity of good and evil that we found in old 1950s Western films. You always know who the goodie is because he's the one wearing the white hat. It prevents that sort of very simplistic way of looking at the world. Imprisoned in a Nazi prison by a regime responsible for the concentration camps and for a world war, Dietrich Bonhoeffer incredibly can write the following words. In his situation, he can say, "Nothing that we despise in the other man is entirely absent from ourselves." And if he can say that in his position, then how much more should we be able to say that in ours? This is one of the lessons of this threefold biblical schema, creation, fall, redemption. It makes for sensitive cultural criticism. We can still denounce, but we don't denounce flippantly. We don't denounce simplistically. Number 3, God's sovereignty, the contingency of power. So thirdly then, the Bible encourages us to see that whatever structures of power and authority exist in the world, they can and almost certainly will fall and be replaced. In a way, I think that makes Christians wary of looking at our particular culture and society as if they're going to be eternal. Mary wonderfully reminds us in the Magnificat that God has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He's scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He's brought down rulers from their thrones, and he's lifted up the humble. He's filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. So when Christians look over the rich and the mighty, the rulers, the power structures of this world, and the cultures over which they preside, we don't see a fixed order. We see a temporary distribution of power and temporary social structures that God can and will turn on their head. And when we see the poor, we know that God can lift them up. As Daniel reminds the great kings of the Babylonian Empire, the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. And therefore Christians are not predisposed to assume that earthly power and earthly structures will always remain stable. We're under no illusions, for example, that democracy will always be with us. And this causes us to call into question, I think, what cultural critics can otherwise all too easily take for granted. That we've arrived at the apex and final resting point of culture, for example, that our culture is the definitive, final statement of human achievement. It's so often the assumption of a lot of cultural criticism, but I don't think it's one that Christians can share. Number 4, biblical binoculars, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. The very fabric of the Bible, the very way that the Bible is put together, has cultural critique built into it. Think about the wisdom literature. Let's take Proverbs and Ecclesiastes as an example. I want to ask a naive question. Why are the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes both in the Bible? Because after all, Proverbs gives the impression that if we make wise decisions, things will go well for us. And if we make foolish decisions, things will go badly for us. It's simple enough, isn't it? But Ecclesiastes, by contrast, suggests that it doesn't really matter whether we make wise or foolish decisions, because the wicked prosper and the wise suffer. And what good is it anyway? Because we're all going to grow old and die, and eventually we'll enjoy what little time we have left, because at the end of the day, it's just one big pantomime of chasing after a wind that we'll never catch. So then we might be forgiven for asking, well, which one is it? Is Proverbs right, or is Ecclesiastes right? And the biblical answer, of course, is yes. Christopher Wright, I think, really helpfully puts it this way. He says, a characteristic of the Old Testament wisdom literature is that it incorporates a self-critical element, a kind of literary and theological deconstruction of some of the strong and positive affirmations of the book of Proverbs. So then wisdom is found in the irreducible tension between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Or as Christopher Wright again puts it, Ecclesiastes is the self-critical moment in the positive vision of Proverbs. This is what Walter Brueggemann calls the Bible's counter-testimony, critiquing its own core testimony, which is Israel's central narrative of God's redemption and providence. And this is a particularly sophisticated approach to life and culture. Remaining in the wisdom literature for a moment, number 5, Proverbs, the Bible and secular wisdom. The coexistence of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes shamefacedly side by side in the Bible is far from the only juxtaposition in the wisdom literature. So let me ask a further question. Why is a proportion of the book of Proverbs vanishingly close to wisdom texts of extra-biblical traditions? So some of the book of Proverbs, for example, is to be found in Mesopotamian wisdom. And chapters 22 to 24 from King Lemuel, entitled Sayings of the Wise in Proverbs, is thought to be of Egyptian origin. What does this mean? Well, its implications, I think, are profound, and they're far-reaching. We know from 2 Timothy 3:16, don't we, that all scripture is God-breathed, including then this Mesopotamian and Egyptian wisdom that's included in the book of Proverbs. Now, does that mean that all Mesopotamian and Egyptian wisdom is God-breathed? No, of course not. But at least some of the wisdom of these two traditions, formulated by people who rejected the God of the Bible, was seen fit to be incorporated in God's scriptures. Curious. The least we can say about that, I think, is that the wisdom of the world, while not making us directly wise for salvation, can, at least in some cases, make us wise for living in this world in a way that the Bible understands wisdom. And this is another reason that the Christians should be unusually open to non-Christian learning. And this is something that Augustine well understood in his On Christian Teaching, where he writes, "We were not wrong to learn the alphabet just because they say that the god Mercury was its patron. Nor should we avoid justice and virtue just because they dedicated temples to justice and virtue and preferred to honor those values not in their minds, but in the form of stones. A person who is a good and true Christian should realize that the truth belongs to his Lord wherever it's found, gathering and acknowledging it, even in pagan literature, but rejecting its superstitious vanities." So Christian cultural critique then should be open to gathering wisdom from all traditions wherever it's found. Number 6, the prophets as Israel's inbuilt critics. In the life of the nation of Israel, God ordains not only officers of power and administration, the judges and the kings, he ordains an office of, if you like, critic, the prophet. Biblical prophets have a very peculiar relationship, don't they, to political and ecclesiastical power. The office of prophet isn't inherited, it's not bequeathed. Prophecy is not institutionalized in that way in Israel, in the sense that there's no school of prophecy. There's no professors of prophecy in Israel, no certificates of prophetic practice. True prophets are not taught. The one exception is Elijah and Elisha, but apart from that, they're not born and they're not purchased. And therefore, they've got no debts to repay, no party line to hold, no paymaster to please. Prophets come from every social stratum as well. Amos was a shepherd. Isaiah, son of Amos, was of noble descent. The prophet is a divinely mandated, unaffiliated critic who answers directly to God and to God only. Now, this is a remarkable figure that this should be part of Israelite society. The prophet is an ancestor of Shakespeare's fools, who of course speak truth to power, don't they? And also of modern day satirists. And the Old Testament prophet is a crucial element in the social imaginary that leads to our own free press, independent of government. What other major text or what other major ideology includes explicitly such a sanctioned counter voice to the official kingly administration? There's no such counter voice in Marx's Capital. There's no such counter voice in modern political parties. Even contemporary newspapers don't carry a column that argues against the main line of the newspaper. It is extraordinary that we have prophets in the Bible. Number 7, biblical self-critique. It's important to note that the critique of the prophets is not mainly directed at the other nations out there. It's mainly directed within, at Israel itself. And this impulse to self-critique is a really important dynamic in the Christian view of culture. Indeed, as the theologian Richard Bauckham says, it is of the highest importance that the Christian tradition contains in its recognition of the Bible as uniquely normative, a self-critical element, integral and essential to it. This prophetic gesture of self-critique isn't limited to the Old Testament prophets at all. In case after case after case in the Bible, we find that those who in other traditions would be presented as flawless heroes are relentlessly and ruthlessly undermined. So the patriarch Abraham is shown to be a coward who betrays his wife. The great Moses is presumptive in striking the rock. He's barred from entering the promised land. David, Israel's greatest king, is an adulterer and a manipulator. Peter, first among Jesus's disciples, is impulsive. He denies Christ 3 times. Paul killed Christians for a living and calls himself the greatest of sinners. And there is, of course, only one exception to this in the whole of the Bible, and that is Jesus Christ himself. There's no blind hagiography of heroes in the Bible at all. In fact, this self-critique sets a pattern for the whole of Christian history. And it's a pattern in which, as the philosopher Simon Critchley argues, the history of the church from Athanasius through Luther to Kierkegaard, quote, can be understood as a gesture of reformation, whereby the essentially secular order of the existing or established church is undermined in order to approach the religious core of faith. For theologian Oliver O'Donovan, this self-critical impulse has so shaped the modern world, so shaped the way that we as a culture see ourselves, that the conscientious individual, as conceived by modernity, is a distorted version of something genuinely redemptive, the evangelical summons to be judges of ourselves. Now, Karl Marx famously asserted that the critique of religion is the prerequisite of every critique. And of course, the critique of religion is important, and the Bible does a great deal of critiquing religion. But I wonder whether it's more accurate, in fact, to say that self-critique is the prerequisite of every critique. And the Bible certainly does a great deal of that. Number 8, the Multi-Perspectival Bible. In the same way that Proverbs and Ecclesiastes present two complementary and ultimately irreducible experiences of the same reality, time and again in the Bible, we see instances of an event being presented from multiple perspectives. So consider, for example, the first 2 chapters of the Bible that present different perspectives on the creation story. Or think of the major parallels, but also the significant differences between the books of 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles, describing the same events. Or think of the fact that there are no fewer than 4 gospel accounts in the New Testament. Or the fact that we've got epistles from Paul and Peter and James and John and whoever it was that wrote Hebrews, each with their own emphases and literary styles. In all these cases, the Bible isn't synthesizing multiple perspectives to present one unified view, but it's presenting these multiple perspectives side by side to give you different aspects of a complex reality. The Bible also contains books that provide perspectives that sit alongside the main narrative, doesn't it? Almost like side chapels off the main nave of a cathedral. So think of Ruth, for example, or Esther, or Jonah. They're fascinating examples of perspectives that are very different, both in their scale and in their texture, to Israel's core narrative of the rise and fall of the great kings. But these side chapel narratives are only possible because they link in to the main narrative. And these books throw a particular light, have a particular inflection of the grand story of which they're part. They give another perspective on it. Or in addition to the Bible's perspectival richness, think about the way in which it also contains such a multiplicity of genres of writing. In addition to narrative, we've got poetry, we've got lots of poetry, depending on what you class as poetry, almost a third of the Bible is poetry. We've got Proverbs, we've got Psalms, we've got laments, we've got epistles, we've got apocalyptic, and so on and so on. And the Bible is unusual, isn't it? Among sacred texts and among philosophical and ideological texts as well, for being so generically diverse. Now, some models of cultural critique in our own society risk reducing themselves to a generic monotone. They're always sarcastic, or they're always ironic, or they're always angry and violent. But biblical cultural critique is never a monotone. It's not always sarcastic, for example, although it can be in certain passages. It also embraces the genres of lament, apocalyptic, parable, proverb, and so on. It's a rich palette of analytical colours, of modes of cultural critique in the Bible. The Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Upanishads, the Book of Mormon, Dianetics, the Analects, the Republic, the Summa Theologica, the Sentences, the Critique of Pure Reason, even Derrida's text, The Double Session, that sits Socrates alongside Mallarmé, none of these can hold a candle to the Bible's generic richness. Next, in contrast to all other major sacred texts, the Bible was written over a span of centuries, and it describes a diverse variety of social and cultural settings. Some of it is describing a nomadic social situation. Some of it is a nation enslaved. Then we're back to the nomadic, through the tribal, the monarchical, the prosperous sovereign nation, the exiled nation, the occupied nation. And all situations are described in the Bible. We've got the extended family, the tribe, the nation, the exiled, the remnant, and all the way through from the second millennium BC to the first decades of the first millennium AD. And in all these different ways, the Bible is, in C.S. Lewis's terms, an old book on steroids. In other words, it's a book that doesn't share our contemporary assumptions or our contemporary blind spots. It wasn't written in or for our particular culture. More than that, though, it's a library of old books, illuminating our blind spots and assaulting our prejudices from a kaleidoscopic range of different viewpoints simultaneously. Indeed, the Bible can't be contained by any one epoch or in any one social structure, least of all the angst-ridden opulence of late capitalism, in part because it is itself not contained by any particular social or cultural moment. And this perspectival diversity of the Bible does justice, I would suggest, to the polyphony and the complexity of human experience. But what all of this multiplicity introduces into the biblical sensibility, into the biblical view of the world, is a nuance and sensitivity to perspective. There isn't always just one right way to talk about a set of events. And with the Bible, within the Bible itself, we can see the wisdom of different perspectives brought to bear on the same events. The Bible's not trapped in any particular cultural setting, least of all our own. And it's not trapped by any particular mode of production or any particular social structure. That is incredibly liberating and challenging for Christian cultural criticism. Number 9, the transcultural Bible. So our present cultural moment, perhaps, is caught in a tension between cultural imperialism on one hand and cultural relativism on the other. We tend to think that our values are the best values and we want everybody else to share them. And we want to respect and protect the integrity of every other culture, which is incidentally one of our values as well. And this dichotomy makes for really quite poor cultural criticism because it draws us either to dismiss other cultures as quote unquote underdeveloped, or to refuse to pass any judgment on any cultures at all apart from our own. But in the Bible, in the very warp and woof of the biblical texts, we're shown a more subtle way forward. Because, first of all, the Bible is not acultural in its understanding of truth. Even in the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 7, the worship of God isn't and shouldn't be abstracted from specific cultural identities and forms. Every tongue, tribe, and nation is there, not sort of amalgamated into one generic culture. As Leslie Newbigin notes, the idea that one can or could at any time separate out by some process of distillation a pure gospel, unadulterated by any cultural accretions, is an illusion. And Newbigin goes on to insist that this is not merely incidental. To suggest that the gospel can be understood or communicated apart from culture is, he says, an abandonment to the gospel. For the gospel is about the word made flesh. And this also means, incidentally, that Christians are never critiquing culture from outside it. We are always inevitably shaped by our culture, even when we're critiquing it. We always share many of its assumptions, often without realizing it. We're never outside culture looking in. Second, biblical truth is not monocultural. There's not one linguistic, historic, geographical culture that is better than all the others for the reception of the gospel message, such that as Christians mature, they will all gravitate towards that one culture. On the contrary, the worship on the new earth in Revelation 7 again gathers people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, and they remain people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. As Newbigin rightly argues, the biblical gospel must therefore call into question every human culture. There's no culture that gets a pass when it comes to being exposed to the searching light of the Bible. Thirdly, biblical truth is not pan-cultural. In other words, it's not the case that all cultures equally adequately reflect God, so that they're all roads of equal length up the mountain that leads to God. This would require us to hold that God is reflected as much in democracy as in despotism, as much in the kindergarten as in the concentration camp, and that's patently ridiculous. Fourthly, biblical truth is transcultural. The message of the Bible and the ability to sing God's praises isn't confined to any one culture, but is shared by members of all tongues, tribes, and nations, who can equally praise God around the throne in heaven without having their tongues, tribes, and nationhoods left at the door. And the message of the Bible, therefore, will affirm some aspects of all cultures, and it will challenge some aspects of all cultures. And it can find a home in all cultures, even as it transforms them from within. As Tim Keller, I think, really helpfully notes, when Africans began to read the Bible in their own languages, many began to see in Christ the final solution to their own historic longings and aspirations as Africans. The best reception of Christianity on the African continent wasn't westernizing. It was allowing the full expression of African values and ideas as they were transformed, as also Western culture should be transformed and challenged and changed by the gospel as well. The Christian faith, it's worth reflecting on this, I think. The Christian faith is a truly worldwide community. There are currently around 250,000 Christians in Iran. There are over 100 million Christians, we think, in China. Christianity, furthermore, is the most radically de-centered of all the world faiths and of all the world ideologies. Its geographical center has moved multiple times in its history, as no other religions has. And the geographical center of secular humanism certainly hasn't. It was and remains Western. So Christianity was born in the Middle East. It captured the mind and heart of Europe. It spread to the Americas, and it's now by and large in decline in the West, but rapidly growing in the Far East and Latin America, in China, and in much of Africa. And this transcultural diversity within the Christian church dwarfs the diversity of those who are claiming that the West today, the church in the West today is bigoted, and that secular humanism is the true standard bearer of diversity. Secular humanism looks very culturally narrow compared to the rich diversity of Christian expressions worldwide. So then, for these 9 reasons, and for many more reasons that we could discuss if we had 2 seminars concerning the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection and eschatology that we haven't even touched in this session, for all these reasons, time and time again, the Bible predisposes us to be open and discerning and deep and discriminating and thoughtful cultural critics. Now, does this mean that Christians are always better cultural critics than non-Christians? No, clearly not. Here we are, aren't we, you and me, and we leave a lot to be desired. But we have the resources in our own tradition, in the Bible, to push ourselves always towards a better, richer, and deeper cultural criticism than we're currently practicing. And this sort of rich and nuanced cultural criticism really is, I think, the need of the day. We are, aren't we, a fractured, a conflicted society. We're an oppositional society today, increasingly drifting apart across political and ideological divides. Now, different groups in society today consume different media, hold different values, even believe different facts and have different truths. What we're crying out for is a mode of cultural critique and public discourse that doesn't dismiss any position out of hand before examining it, that doesn't speak in an echo chamber, that doesn't trade caricatures or seek to destroy its opposition. And for all these reasons, now is the time to be engaging in discerning, constructive, critical, richly biblical cultural critique. Thank you. Now, I believe that we are going to split up into breakout rooms now. I've prepared some questions that you might want to consider in the breakout rooms. I think they're going to be pasted to you in the chat. And I will hand over to Kevin to explain exactly how that will work.
Okay, it's back to me briefly. Folks, I hope you found that as thought-provoking as I did. I think, judging by the notes I've just taken, there'll be a lot there to chew on over the next few days and unpack for myself. But to help you make a start on that process, we thought we'd spend a few minutes in smaller groups where you get a chance to chat together about any of the ideas that you've heard. And Chris prepared a bunch of questions for us, and you'll see that now sitting in the chat area to the side of your screen. Click on chat at the bottom, you'll see it. And what we'll do now is John is going to randomly assign us to breakout groups. He's going to allow us 20 minutes on the clock, and when you're done, it will return you back automatically into the central group. And anybody who wants to raise a question with Chris directly or wants to do a bit of feedback from their group that they think might be helpful will be welcome to do that, and then I'll close off. Okay, so make the best of the time that you've got available to you. I may encourage you to use this. So here we go. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you all survived your breakout groups and that you were nice to each other. I'm sure you were. And that you had good conversations, more to the point. So we've got a few minutes left, and at the end of that, I will wrap up and send you on your way. But before we get to that point, I'm hopeful that all of you have found as much nourishment in this as we did in our group. Are there any of you who would fancy just raising your hand and asking Chris a question, or perhaps feeding back a thought or a point that emerged from your breakout group? I see that a few didn't make it back from their groups. Now, Stephen, which is Stephen? So I'm looking for Stephen Dooley. John, do you want to highlight Stephen? Stephen has raised his, sorry, Siobhan Dooley has raised a hand.
That's the most pronunciation of my name yet.
My eyesight's not very good with the the thing. Go for it.
So my question is, Chris, please would you unpack what you meant by the Bible's a mixture of good and evil, and how does that interact with the inerrant, infallible doctrine of inerrancy and infallibility?
Yeah, thank you, Siobhan. I don't think I was saying that the Bible is a mixture of good and evil, but that everything in creation, from a Christian point of view, is a mixture of good and evil. So our ultimate measure of goodness is not within the universe, is not within the created order. No one is good but God alone. And therefore, our predisposition as Christians should be, with every cultural artifact and every cultural event that we encounter, to expect to find something that's good in it. And also to expect to find something that's bad or twisted or abused in it. So it wasn't a comment on the Bible, but it was a comment on the particular openness of the Christian to engage with all cultural manifestations in a way that expects that engagement to be nuanced, in a way that if you find your ultimate measure of good and evil in this world, it's hard to have that same openness, because some areas of or aspects of the created order have to be protected because they provide you with your measure of goodness.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, who's next? Oh, you're all, Julia. Julia.
No profound comments, but just to say a really massive thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed it. It's the first Round Church webinar I've been to for a very long time, and I was drawn by the title, and it was every bit as engaging as I'd hoped, and in very different ways. And we had a great breakout group, really good discussions. We sort of started on unpicking parts that's had meant the most to us from what you said, and looking at, you know, whether Christians make good cultural critiquers. I think we thought we at least are equipped to understand a lot of the cultural references of our Western society in which we've grown up, a lot more than people who've thrown the baby out with the bathwater and decided that just because they don't want to become Christians, they don't want to know anything about it. I mean, that's a huge loss up to the present day, but certainly up to about sort of 100 years ago, if you haven't got that knowledge. But and we did get on to talking a bit about sort of, you know, statues and the like, but I think a sort of sense of humility actually was there for all of us. I think there's this wonderful idea of all the contrasts and the paradoxes that are there inherent in the Bible, and all the perspectives which, as you say, don't come to one single answer, but are there for us to sort of hold and be aware of. I think that should teach us all, a humility, as well as you say, perhaps harder to find, I don't know, is that sort of moral goodness pole, really, also to tap into. So anyway, hope that makes sense, but thank you very much. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Julia. Chris, did you want to say anything further to that?
I guess the only thing that I want to add there is you're just echoing what Julia says about the Bible, and that there's a sense in which perhaps increasingly Christians are marginal culturally in terms of outlook to the dominant, or what in some circles you might call the hegemonic culture of our age, and that gives you a particular acuity in critiquing it. I'm not suggesting that we're completely outsiders, because, as I said, everybody who lives within a particular culture is so imbued with that culture's values and assumptions that it would be incredibly naive of us to think that we're looking in from the outside. But the position of being marginal, I think, does afford you the chance to see certain things become visible, that if you share, if you stand right in the bullseye of the hegemonic culture, you wouldn't notice. And so I think there's a wonderful opportunity there for Christians to serve society by noticing things that you can perceive from the margins in a way that might not be as easily perceived from the center.
Thank you. That's most helpful. Anyone else?
Yes,
oh, Ian. Ian first, then Olaf. Ian?
Okay. Hi, thank you, Chris. In hearing what you had to say about the multi-perspectival Bible, the differences in which God reveals himself in different cultures, there was at one stage almost, I felt, almost too much openness, which could lead you to become overly tentative in your cultural criticism and overly uncertain. And somebody in our group was saying, well, how do we respond to the whole LGBT agenda, which seems to be so defiant of creation, which seems to be so destructive of what it is to be human? So how does one get the balance of, as it were, really listening and really sort of seeing Bonhoeffer's view when he was in prison of being aware of the fact that even however awful Nazism was, that mustn't mean to say that he could dismiss every single Nazi. How do we approach looking at something like the LGBT movement, which seems so fundamentally illiberal, as well as, apart from anything else, as well as being destructive?
Thank you, Ian. That's a really helpful question. One very helpful thing that I've read on that topic recently is Carl Truman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And what I think he so helpfully does is he traces the genealogy of the type of thinking that has resulted in the contemporary expressions of LGBTIQ plus sort of activism. And one of the very helpful things that he does, I think, is he shows how intimately entwined a lot of it has been with Christian ideas. And I'm not saying that the movement itself is Christian, but that it borrows the capital of concern for the marginalized, for example, from a Christian view of the world. And I guess what you'd want to do in engaging with a movement like that is first of all, and this is not the only move that you've made, but first of all, try and see the lie of the land from the point of view of people within the movement, because I think until you can do that, you're not really in a position to be able to critique it, because you don't really understand it. Understand why it's so attractive, so intoxicating, so important for the people who are in that movement, and be able to articulate that in ways that people within the movement will say, yes, that's right, you've got it, you've understood it. And then I think you're ready to take the step back and say, what principles here are at play that have been perhaps misunderstood or taken out of a biblical context. And the framework that I think you'd want to run that through is the framework that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 1, where he takes the dominant values of his age. So that Jews demand miraculous signs and Greeks seek wisdom. These are the things that you really value. These are the cultural ideas that you think are incredibly important, that you're willing to go into battle for. In many ways, in the same way that identity is very important for many people today. What Paul does is he steps through 4 stages in relation to those values. He says, this is what you value. This is why you can't have the fullness of it in the way that you're searching for it in the moment. So, for example, dear Jews, you're never going to find the fullness of power if you're only searching for it in these miraculous signs. And Greeks, you're never going to have the full flowering of wisdom if you're only looking for it in your philosophers. And then he does the very scandalous thing, the thing that causes people to switch off and walk away, which is he says that the fullness of what you're searching for is actually, scandalously, only available at the cross of Christ, which is the last place that you'd ever think of looking for it. So if you want true power, look to the powerlessness of a man hanging on the cross bleeding to death. If you want true wisdom, look at the foolishness of a crucified criminal. And then the final move that he makes is to say, this is the wisdom of God and the power of God. This is the fullness of wisdom. If you go through the cross, if you're willing to humble yourself and go through the cross, then you'll find the fullness of wisdom. And I think you can do that with any major cultural value. And so identifying what is important in movements like the LGBTIQ plus movement. And I think one of the things there is it's a complex movement, that there are lots of aspects of it, there are lots of different agendas within it, and it's not one idea. But for sake of argument, let's pick on something like freedom. I want to be free to express myself. And what you would do is then very carefully, you would run freedom through that Pauline schema and show how it's not a bad ideal. It's something that it's right to want, but there's always going to be a frustration in searching for it apart from Christ, and then show how Christ brings the fullness of that value. And it's not a sort of glib gotcha, there is Christ waiting for you at the top of the mountain that you're scrambling up, poor old you. There has to be, doesn't there, for all these fundamental human values, a sympathy, a listening, an empathy. But I think ultimately that's where you would end up with saying Christ is actually the fullness of what you're searching for. I know that sounds ridiculous. I know that sounds like the last place you would ever look. But if you're willing to look there, you will be able to find the fullness of what you can only partially grasp at otherwise.
Thanks, Chris. That was very helpful. Olaf, you're on next.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris and everybody. Just a quick clarification question. When you were talking about point 5, or I think point 4, about Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, I think you mentioned that they have a very advanced or complex character of self-evaluation. Could you just expand on that a bit? Because I didn't really understand it that well.
Yeah, thank you, Olaf. Yes, I think my description at that point was a little hard to understand. Let me try and have another go now. So the view of the world that you get from Proverbs is, if you do certain things and if you act in a certain way, certain results will follow. So if you're not a sluggard and you get up early and do your work, you'll be prosperous. And if you are a sluggard, you will not be prosperous. And that's pretty clear in Proverbs. It's a nice, easy way of looking at the world. And then you think, okay, good, right, I know where we stand. And then you open the book of Ecclesiastes and you see that, in a sense, the complete opposite view of the world. You can get up early in the morning and do all you like, but someone else might take your money from you and you're going to die anyway. And then you think, hold on, how do those two views of the world fit together? Is it Proverbs, if you do if you put the coin in the slot, you'll get the thing at the bottom? Is that the way we're supposed to view the world? Or is it all meaningless and a chasing after the wind? And what the Bible does wonderfully, I think, is it puts these two side by side and it says, you work it out. Because in a sense, that's the way that life works. Sometimes we do get the impression, don't we? And sometimes it does seem to fit with the way the world works, that the people who work hard get on and people who don't, and so forth. And it's nice and neat. And sometimes you wake up in the morning and everything seems to be frustrated. G.K. Chesterton's got this lovely quote, I think it's in Orthodoxy, of saying the frustrating thing about the world is that it's almost rational. It almost works according to principles, but it never completely does. And so I think what the Bible does by putting these two views side by side is it gives us a much more richly textured, adequate sense of the way that the world really is, because we inhabit both of these worlds at different moments. And it's not that you can synthesize them, because our own experience isn't synthesized. Sometimes we do feel as though the world works quite well, and sometimes we don't. And you can't sort of average those out and have one constant experience, because that's not how life works. That's not how reality is. And so the Bible doesn't sort of synthesize Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and have one book. It puts them both in there. It's the broader principle here is what John Stott talks about in the introduction of Balanced Christianity, his book Balanced Christianity. He's quoting Charles Simeon. And he says that the Bible often presents two extremes side by side and says it's both of these. It doesn't collapse things into the Aristotelian golden mean all the time, but it's unashamed in presenting different perspectives and saying, well, both of these have a ring of reality about them, and they're both important and they both need mentioning. But I think our culture, and it probably is a peculiarity of our culture, loves to synthesize and to reduce to a single message. And so we sometimes balk at the way that the Bible deals with reality, because we say either, which is it, or let's try and synthesize these. Let's harmonize the Gospels and just have one account rather than having the four. Let's decide, let's synthesize Genesis 1 and 2. But again and again, the Bible doesn't. And I think that in itself should give us pause for thought and say, what is it about our bent for synthesizing? What does that tell us about us? And what does it tell us about the Bible that it tends not to do that? And I think that can be a real learning moment for us in making our own cultural assumptions visible to us as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. Yeah. So it's by the juxtaposition of Ecclesiastes and Proverbs that you get your point, not that either one of them on their own has that quality. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Olaf. Thank you for all of you who've asked questions and engaged.